In the unforgiving terrain of the American frontier, where justice was measured by the speed of a draw and mercy was rarer than water in the desert, one man's journey would test the very foundations of what it meant to be human. This is not a tale of quick gunfights or daring bank robberies, but something far more profound, a story of a broken soul finding redemption in the most unexpected place, guided by the weathered hands of an old ranch owner who understood that sometimes the greatest battles are fought not with bullets, but with compassion. What happens when a man who has lost everything encounters someone willing to give everything? In the harsh landscape of 1880s Montana, where survival often meant abandoning one's conscience, two unlikely souls would discover that healing comes not from running away from pain, but from learning to sit with it, understand it, and ultimately transform it into something beautiful. This is the story of Jake Morrison, a drifter carrying wounds deeper than any bullet could create, and Samuel Old Sam Fletcher, a ranch owner whose quiet wisdom would prove more powerful than any sheriff's badge. Together, they would learn that sometimes the most important journeys happen not across vast plains, but within the quiet spaces of the human heart. The dust kicked up by Jake Morrison's worn boots seemed to follow him like a persistent shadow as he limped down the main street of Cedar Ridge. His right leg dragged slightly, a reminder of the ambush that had changed everything 3 months ago. The late afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on his black hat, and sweat stains marked his faded blue shirt like badges of a man who had been riding hard for too long. Jake's eyes, once bright green like spring grass, now held the dull sheen of someone who had seen too much and felt too little. His face, weathered beyond his 28 years, bore a scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, another souvenir from that terrible day when his world had come crashing down. He carried himself with the careful movements of a man who expected trouble around every corner, his hand never straying far from the Colt .45 that hung low on his right hip. The town of Cedar Ridge was like many others scattered across the Montana Territory, a collection of weathered wooden buildings that seemed to cling to existence by sheer stubbornness. The saloon's batwing doors squeaked in the warm breeze, and somewhere a dog barked lazily. A few townspeople moved about their business, but Jake noticed how their eyes followed him with the wariness reserved for strangers who looked like trouble. He had been riding for days without a clear destination, just moving because staying still meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering. The memories were like thorns that had worked their way under his skin, his younger brother Tommy's laugh, his sister Mary's singing voice, and his father's strong hands teaching him to rope cattle. All of it was gone now, buried in the charred remains of the Morrison Ranch outside of Billings. Jake's horse, a tired bay mare named Dolly, snorted and shook her head as they approached the general store. She was as worn down as her rider, her ribs showing through a coat that had once been sleek and shining. Jake had sold his good horses weeks ago, along with his silver saddle and his father's gold pocket watch, just to buy food and ammunition. Dolly was all he had left, and even she was borrowed time. "Easy, girl," Jake murmured, his voice hoarse from days of silence. He tied Dolly's reins to the hitching post and checked his pockets for the few coins that remained. $3.25. Enough for some beans and maybe grain for Dolly, but not much else. The bell above the general store door chimed as Jake entered, and the proprietor, a thin man with nervous eyes, looked up from his ledger. The man's gaze took in Jake's appearance, the gun, the scar, the hollow look in his eyes, and his hand moved subtly towards something beneath the counter. "Can I help you?" the storekeeper asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Need some supplies," Jake replied, approaching the counter with slow, deliberate steps. "Beans, hardtack if you have it. Some grain for my horse." The storekeeper nodded and began gathering the items, stealing glances at Jake as he worked. Jake could feel the man's fear like a cold draft, and it made something twist in his stomach. Was this what he had become? A man who inspired fear in honest people? "That'll be $4.50, the storekeeper said, setting the supplies on the counter. Jake's heart sank. He counted out his money slowly, hoping he had miscounted earlier, but the math was unforgiving. "I only have $3.25, he said quietly. The storekeeper's expression hardened. "Then, you don't have enough." Jake stared at the supplies on the counter, feeling the familiar burn of shame in his chest. He thought about his father's voice, "A Morrison pays his debts and earns his keep." But what was he now? He wasn't even sure he deserved the name Morrison anymore. "I could work for the difference," Jake offered, hating how small his voice sounded. "I'm good with horses, cattle. Whatever you need." "Don't need any help," the man replied curtly. "This is a respectable establishment." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. He straightened, his hand instinctively moving toward his gun, and the storekeeper stepped back, his face pale. For a moment, the only sound was the ticking of the old clock on the wall and the distant sound of horses in the street. "I'm not looking for trouble," Jake said, forcing his hand away from his weapon. "Just trying to survive." "The supplies stay here until you can pay in full," the storekeeper said, his voice shaking slightly but determined. Jake nodded once and turned to leave, the bell chiming again as he stepped back into the harsh sunlight. Outside, Dolly whinnied softly, and Jake could see her ribs more clearly in the bright light. She needed that grain. They both needed the food. He untied Dolly and led her slowly down the street, his mind racing through options. He could rob the store. God knew he had fallen far enough that it seemed like a possibility. He could try another town, though they all seemed to have the same distrustful faces and the same reluctance to help a stranger who looked like trouble. As they walked, Jake noticed a group of cowboys riding toward the town. They wore clean clothes and sat their horses with the easy confidence of men who belonged somewhere. Their leader, a tall man with silver hair, nodded politely to the townspeople they passed. Jake felt a stab of envy so sharp it almost took his breath away. The cowboys stopped at the saloon, and Jake heard their easy laughter as they dismounted. One of them, a young man about Tommy's age, said something that made the others chuckle. The sound was like salt in an open wound. Jake led Dolly to the water trough and let her drink while he tried to figure out his next move. The sun was getting lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded him of the flames that had consumed his family's ranch. He closed his eyes and tried to push the memory away, but it came anyway, as it always did. The raiders had come at sunset, just like this one. Jake had been in town, selling cattle, while Tommy and Mary were home with their father. By the time Jake had seen the smoke on the horizon and raced back, it was too late. The house was gone, the barn was burning, and his family lay scattered in the yard like broken dolls. The sheriff had made all the right noises about justice and investigation, but Jake knew the truth. The Castellano gang had been hitting ranches across the territory, and the law was either bought off or too scared to do anything about it. Justice, if it came at all, would have to come from Jake's gun. But 3 months of hunting had taught him a hard lesson. The Castellanos were ghosts, appearing only to strike and then vanishing into the Badlands where no law could follow. And Jake, alone and running out of money, was no closer to finding them than when he had started. A hand on his shoulder made him spin around, his gun half-drawn before he realized it was one of the cowboys from the saloon. The man was older, with kind eyes and graying hair beneath his hat. "Easy, son," the man said, his hands raised peacefully. "Didn't mean to startle you." Jake relaxed slightly but kept his hand near his weapon. "What do you want?" "Name's Samuel Fletcher. Most folks call me Sam. I own the Double F Ranch about 10 miles north of here." The man studied Jake with eyes that seemed to see more than they should. "Couldn't help but notice you and your horse look like you've been traveling hard." Jake said nothing, waiting for the man to get to the point. In his experience, strangers who started conversations usually wanted something. "I also couldn't help but notice your conversation with Hartwell in the store," Sam continued. "He's a good man but careful with his trust. Had some trouble with drifters before." "I'm not looking for handouts," Jake said stiffly. Sam smiled, and it transformed his weathered face. "Didn't figure you were. Man, with your bearing and the way you carry that iron, I guess you're more used to earning your keep. Question is, are you looking for work?" Jake studied the older man carefully. Sam Fletcher didn't look like someone who made rash decisions or trusted easily. His clothes were well made but practical, and his hands bore the calluses of a man who wasn't afraid of hard work. Most importantly, he didn't seem afraid, which was unusual. Most people who got close enough to really look at Jake these days saw something that made them step back. "What kind of work?" Jake asked cautiously. "Ranch work. Tending cattle, mending fences, breaking horses. The kind of work that builds character and gives a man time to think." Sam paused, his gaze steady. The kind of work that pays fair wages for an honest day's labor. Jake felt something stir in his chest, something he hadn't felt in months. Hope, maybe, though he didn't trust it. Why would you offer work to a stranger? For all you know, I could be a thief or a killer. Sam nodded thoughtfully. You could be. But I've been reading men for 40 years, son, and I see something in you that tells me you weren't always what you are today. Sometimes a man just needs a chance to remember who he used to be. The words hit Jake harder than any physical blow could have. He felt his throat tighten and had to look away, focusing on Dolly as she continued to drink from the trough. When he looked back, Sam was still watching him with those patient, understanding eyes. I'm not good company, Jake said finally. I've got troubles. Most men worth knowing do, Sam replied. Question is whether you're willing to work through them or let them drag you down further. Jake was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with himself. Part of him wanted to accept, wanted to believe that maybe there was still a chance for something better. But another part whispered that he didn't deserve kindness, that he had failed everyone who had ever mattered to him. The work pays $2 a week, plus room and board, Sam continued. It's honest work on honest land. No questions asked about your past, but I expect honesty about your present. Can you give me that? Jake looked at Dolly, her ribs showing through her dull coat, then at his own hands, stained with dust and marked with the calluses of a man who had been riding hard for too long. When was the last time he had slept in a real bed? When was the last time he had eaten a meal that didn't come from a can? I don't know how to be around people anymore, Jake admitted, the words coming out rougher than he intended. Lucky for you, cattle don't require much conversation, Sam said with a gentle smile. And the ranch is big enough that you can find plenty of space when you need it. But when you're ready for company, it'll be there too. Jake felt something break loose inside his chest, some knot of tension that had been wound tight for months. He looked at Sam Fletcher, the stranger who was offering him something he wasn't sure he deserved, and made a decision that surprised himself. All right, he said quietly. I'll try it. But if it doesn't work out, then you move on with my blessing and a full belly, Sam finished. Fair enough? Jake nodded, not trusting his voice. Sam clapped him on the shoulder again, and this time Jake didn't flinch. Good. Let's get your horse fed and your supplies sorted, then we'll head to the ranch. My wife Sarah will want to meet you, and our cook Miguel makes the best beef stew in the territory. As they walked back toward the general store, Jake felt something he hadn't experienced in months. For the first time since that terrible sunset 3 months ago, he wasn't just running away from something. He was walking toward something new, something that might just offer the chance to remember who Jake Morrison used to be, before the pain and anger had consumed everything else. The sun was setting behind the mountains as they approached the store, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and reds. But, this time, the colors didn't remind Jake of flames and destruction. Instead, they looked like the promise of a new day coming, and, for the first time in longer than he could remember, Jake Morrison allowed himself to hope. The Double F Ranch spread out before them like a piece of heaven carved into the Montana landscape. Rolling green pastures dotted with cattle stretched toward distant mountains, and a clear stream wound its way through the property like a silver ribbon. The main house was built from logs and stone, with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides and windows that glowed warmly in the gathering dusk. Jake sat his horse beside Sam, trying to take in the scope of what he was seeing. It wasn't the largest ranch he had ever encountered, but everything about it spoke of care and attention. The fences were well maintained, the outbuildings were solid and practical, and the cattle looked healthy and content. It was the kind of place his father had always dreamed of building, before the Castellanos had turned those dreams to ash. It's beautiful, Jake said softly, surprised by the genuine admiration in his voice. Sarah and I built it from nothing over 22 years, Sam said with quiet pride. Every fence post, every stone in that foundation, every head of cattle represents sweat and dreams and the kind of stubbornness that won't quit when things get hard. As they rode closer to the house, Jake could see a woman on the porch, a lantern in her hand. Even in the dim light, he could tell she was watching them with the alertness of someone who had learned to be cautious about strangers. When she recognized Sam, her posture relaxed, but Jake noticed her eyes remained sharp as they approached. "That would be Sarah," Sam said with warmth that made Jake's chest tighten. "Fair warning, she's got a way of seeing straight through to a man's soul. Don't take it personal if she seems to know things about you that you haven't told her." They dismounted in front of the house, and Jake found himself smoothing down his shirt and trying to make himself more presentable. It had been so long since he had been around respectable women that he felt suddenly conscious of his appearance. The scar on his face felt more prominent, and he was acutely aware of how his clothes hung loose on his frame. Sarah Fletcher stepped down from the porch, and, in the lamplight, Jake could see she was a handsome woman in her 50s, with silver-streaked brown hair pulled back in a practical bun and kind eyes that held the same wisdom as her husband's. She wore a simple blue dress with an apron, and there was flour on her hands that suggested she had been cooking. "Sarah, this is Jake Morrison," Sam said, moving to stand beside his wife. "He's going to be helping us out around the ranch for a while." Sarah studied Jake with those penetrating eyes, and he felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with physical vulnerability. She seemed to take in everything: the hollow look in his eyes, the careful way he held himself, the gun at his hip, and the pain that he tried so hard to hide. "Mr. Morrison," she said finally, her voice carrying warmth but also a strength that suggested she was nobody's fool. "Welcome to the Double F." "Thank you, ma'am," Jake replied, removing his hat. "I appreciate the opportunity." Sarah's expression softened slightly. "You look like a man who's been carrying a heavy load for too long. We'll see what we can do about that." She turned to her husband. "Sam, why don't you show Mr. Morrison to the bunkhouse while I finish supper? I'll ring the bell when it's ready." The bunkhouse was a solid log building about 50 yards from the main house, with 4 beds, a small stove, and windows that looked out over the pastures. It was simple but clean, with the kind of attention to detail that spoke of people who cared about their workers' comfort. "You'll have it to yourself for now," Sam said, lighting a lamp. "We had 2 hands through the summer, but they moved on a few weeks ago. Looking to try their luck at mining up in Butte. Can't say I blame them, but ranch work suits me better than digging holes in the ground." Jake set his saddlebags on one of the beds, the simple act of putting his belongings down feeling strange after months of constant movement. "What exactly will you need me to do?" "Tomorrow we'll start with checking the herd and mending some fence on the north pasture. Nothing too complicated to begin with. Give you a chance to get your bearings and see how you take to the work." Sam paused at the door. "There's wash water in the pitcher and clean towels in the chest. Supper'll be ready in about an hour." After Sam left, Jake stood alone in the quiet bunkhouse, feeling oddly disconnected from his surroundings. For months, he had slept under the stars or in cheap hotel rooms, always ready to move at a moment's notice. The idea of staying in one place, of having a routine and responsibility to people who seemed to actually care about his well-being, felt foreign and slightly frightening. He walked to the window and looked out over the ranch, watching as lanterns began to appear in the windows of the main house and shadows moved behind the curtains. It was a scene of domestic peace that struck him like a physical ache. This was what he had lost, what the Castellanos had stolen from him. Not just his family, but the possibility of this kind of life, this kind of belonging. Jake washed his face and hands in the basin, wincing as the cool water hit the scar on his cheek. In the small mirror above the washstand, he saw a stranger looking back at him. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, and there was a hardness around his mouth that hadn't been there 6 months ago. He looked like exactly what he had become, a man with nothing left to lose. The dinner bell rang across the yard, and Jake made his way to the main house, his boots loud on the wooden porch steps. Through the windows, he could see the warm glow of the dining room and smell the rich aroma of beef stew and fresh bread. His stomach cramped with hunger, but, more than that, he felt a deep longing for the simple comfort of sharing a meal with people who weren't afraid of him. Sarah opened the door before he could knock, as if she had been watching for him. "Come in, Mr. Morrison. I hope you're hungry." The interior of the house was everything Jake had imagined: comfortable furniture made from local wood, colorful rugs on the polished floors, and books lining shelves that spoke of people who valued learning and culture. Family photographs adorned the mantelpiece, and Jake caught glimpses of Sam and Sarah through the years, along with what appeared to be children at various ages. "Do you have family?" Jake asked, gesturing toward the photographs as they entered the dining room. Sarah's expression grew soft but sad. We had 2 children. Our son Michael and daughter Elizabeth. They're both grown now, living their own lives in San Francisco. Michael runs a shipping business, and Elizabeth married a doctor. They write often, but visits are rare. Jake heard the longing in her voice and understood it intimately. The distance between parents and children, the way life pulled families apart, was something he had watched his own parents struggle with as neighbors' children left for opportunities in bigger towns and cities. Sam appeared from what Jake assumed was his office, rolling down his sleeves and looking pleased. Smells wonderful, dear. Jake, I hope you like beef stew. Sarah makes it better than anyone in the territory. They sat down at a table set with simple but elegant dishes, and Sarah served portions that were generous enough to make Jake's eyes widen. It had been weeks since he had eaten a meal that consisted of more than beans and hardtack, and the sight of real vegetables and tender beef made his mouth water. Sam tells me you've been traveling for a while, Sarah said as they began to eat. Where are you from originally? Jake hesitated, not wanting to spoil the peaceful atmosphere with his story, but feeling an obligation to be honest with people who were showing him such kindness. Near Billings. My family had a ranch there. Had? Sam asked gently. It's gone now, Jake said quietly, focusing on his stew. Raiders burned it out 3 months ago. Killed my father, my brother Tommy, and my sister Mary. The silence that followed was heavy but not uncomfortable. Jake could feel their sympathy without them needing to say anything, and somehow that made it easier to continue. I've been looking for the men who did it ever since. The Castellano gang. But they're like smoke, they're 1 minute, gone the next. Jake looked up at Sam and Sarah, seeing understanding rather than judgment in their eyes. I suppose that's why I look like I do. 3 months of hard writing and harder sleeping will change a man. I'm sorry for your loss, Sarah said simply, and the sincerity in her voice made Jake's throat tighten. That kind of grief, it changes everything, doesn't it? Jake nodded, not trusting his voice. He had heard 100 people offer their condolences, but most of them felt obligatory, things people said because they were expected to. Sarah's words felt different, like they came from someone who understood loss from the inside. Grief is a strange thing, Sam said thoughtfully. It can consume a man if he lets it, turn him into something he never intended to be. Or it can teach him what really matters, help him find strength he didn't know he had. I'm not sure I've learned anything except how to be angry, Jake admitted. Some days that's all that keeps me moving. Anger has its place, Sarah said, surprising him. It can protect you when you need protection, give you strength when everything else fails. But it's not meant to be permanent. It's meant to be a bridge, something to carry you from one place to another. Jake considered this as he continued eating, savoring flavors he had almost forgotten existed. The stew was rich and perfectly seasoned, the bread was warm and fresh, and the simple act of eating at a table with other people felt like a luxury he had forgotten he needed. What was your ranch like? Sam asked. For a moment, Jake considered deflecting the question. Talking about the past hurt, and he had spent months trying to avoid the pain. But something about the warm kitchen and the genuine interest in Sam and Sarah's faces made him want to share. It wasn't as big as this place, but it was good land. My father started it with nothing but determination and a pregnant wife. Built the house himself, cleared the pastures, bred some of the finest cattle in the territory. Jake smiled slightly at the memory. Tommy was going to take it over someday. He had ideas about expanding, maybe getting into horse breeding. Mary wanted to be a teacher. She was the smartest of all of us, always reading books and teaching the ranch hands to read when they wanted to learn. They sound like wonderful people, Sarah said softly. They were. And I couldn't protect them. The words came out bitter and harsh, and Jake immediately regretted them. This wasn't the time or place for his anger. Where were you when it happened? Sam asked, and Jake was surprised by the lack of judgment in the question. In town, selling cattle. I saw the smoke from 5 miles away and rode hard, but. Jake shrugged helplessly. By the time I got there, it was over. The sheriff said they probably died quick, but that doesn't make it hurt less. No, Sarah agreed. It doesn't. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, and Jake found himself relaxing in a way he hadn't in months. The food, the warmth, the simple human companionship, it all combined to create a sense of peace he had thought was lost forever. What will you do when you find them? Sam asked eventually. The men who did this to your family? It was the question Jake had been dreading, because he knew his answer would reveal the darkness that had taken root in his heart. I'm going to kill them, he said simply. All of them. Sam nodded as if this was exactly what he had expected. And, after that? Jake blinked, surprised by the question. After that? Yes. After you've had your revenge. What then? It was a question Jake had never really considered. His entire focus for 3 months had been on finding the Castellanos and making them pay. He had never thought about what would come after, what kind of life he might have once his family was avenged. I don't know, he admitted. I guess I haven't thought that far ahead. Might be worth thinking about, Sam suggested gently. A man needs something to live for, not just something to die for. The words hit Jake like a physical blow, and he found himself staring at his plate, his appetite suddenly gone. What did he have to live for? What was left of Jake Morrison after the revenge was complete? I should get some rest, he said, standing abruptly. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. Of course, Sarah said, rising with him. There's coffee and biscuits in the morning, usually around 6. But don't feel obligated if you're not ready for company. Thank you for supper, Jake said, meaning it. It was the best meal I've had in months. You're welcome here anytime, Mr. Morrison, Sarah replied. This is your home now, for as long as you want it to be. The words followed Jake back to the bunkhouse, echoing in his mind as he prepared for bed. Home. When was the last time anywhere had felt like home? Not since that terrible day when he had ridden up to a pile of smoking rubble where his life used to be. Jake lay in the narrow bed, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling into evening. Somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed softly, and he could hear the gentle sound of wind through the trees. It was peaceful in a way that made his chest ache with longing. But, even as he appreciated the comfort and kindness he had been shown, Jake couldn't shake Sam's question. What would he do after he found the Castellanos? What kind of man would be left when the anger and need for revenge were finally satisfied? As he drifted off to sleep in a real bed for the first time in months, Jake tried to imagine a future beyond his quest for vengeance. But all he could see was darkness, and the haunting question of whether there would be enough of Jake Morrison left to build any kind of life worth living. Jake woke before dawn, his body jerking alert in the way it had learned to do over 3 months of dangerous sleeping. For a moment, he didn't recognize his surroundings, his hand reaching instinctively for his gun before he remembered where he was. The bunkhouse was quiet except for the sound of his own breathing, and pale gray light was beginning to filter through the windows. He had slept better than he had in weeks, but his dreams had been filled with flames and the sound of his sister's voice calling his name. Jake sat on the edge of the bed, running his hands through his hair and trying to shake off the lingering images. Some mornings the dreams felt so real that he had to remind himself his family was truly gone, that he wasn't just having a nightmare he could wake up from. Through the window, he could see smoke rising from the chimney of the main house, and the warm glow of lanterns suggested that Sam and Sarah were already awake. Jake dressed quickly, strapped on his gun belt, and made his way across the yard, his boots crunching on the frost that had formed during the night. The kitchen door was open, and he could smell coffee and bacon cooking. Sarah stood at the stove, already dressed and busy with breakfast preparations, while Sam sat at the table reading what appeared to be a letter, his brow furrowed in concentration. Morning, Jake said from the doorway, not wanting to intrude but drawn by the warmth and activity. Mr. Morrison, Sarah said with a smile that seemed genuinely pleased to see him. You're up early. Coffee's fresh, and breakfast will be ready in a few minutes. Jake accepted a cup of the strong black coffee gratefully, wrapping his hands around the warm mug and inhaling the rich aroma. What time do you normally start work around here? Depends on the season and what needs doing, Sam replied, folding the letter and setting it aside. This time of year, we're usually checking the herd by 7, mending fence when it needs it, preparing for winter feeding. Nothing too complicated, but it keeps us busy. Anything particular you need me to focus on? Sam studied Jake for a moment, as if trying to gauge something. How are you with horses? Besides riding, I mean. Breaking, training, that sort of thing? My father bred and trained horses before he focused on cattle. Taught me everything he knew. Jake felt a familiar pang at the memory of working alongside his father in the corral, learning to read the subtle signs that told you what a horse was thinking. I've got away with them, I suppose. Good. I've got a young stallion that needs work. Beautiful animal, but he's got spirit and hasn't decided whether he trusts humans yet. Previous hands were more interested in beating the fight out of him than earning his respect. Jake nodded, understanding immediately. He had seen too many good horses ruined by men who thought force was the only way to train an animal. I'd like to meet him. After breakfast, we'll take a look. But, first, let's get some food in you. Sarah's cooking will put meat on your bones if you let it. They ate a hearty breakfast of eggs, bacon, biscuits, and fried potatoes that made Jake realize just how malnourished he had become during his months of wandering. The conversation was easy and comfortable, focusing on the work of the ranch and the personalities of the various animals. It felt normal in a way that Jake had almost forgotten was possible. After breakfast, Sam led Jake to a corral behind the barn where a magnificent black stallion paced restlessly, his coat gleaming in the morning sunlight. The horse was young, maybe 3 years old, with the kind of conformation that spoke of excellent breeding and natural athleticism. But there was tension in every line of his body, and his eyes showed the wariness of an animal that had learned not to trust. His name's Thunder, Sam said, leaning against the corral fence. Got him from a breeder near Helena who was going out of business. The man said he was impossible to train, but I think he just hadn't met the right person yet. Jake studied the horse carefully, taking in the way Thunder moved, the alert positioning of his ears, the way he kept his distance from the humans but couldn't quite stop himself from watching them. How long have you had him? About 6 weeks. I've been working with him slowly, trying to build trust, but progress has been limited. He'll take food from my hand, but he won't let me touch him, and he's never had a saddle on his back. Jake nodded, understanding the challenge. Some horses were naturally trusting, willing to accept human guidance with minimal fuss. Others, like Thunder, required patience and a more nuanced approach. They had to choose to cooperate, and that choice couldn't be forced. Mind if I spend some time with him? Just getting acquainted? Go ahead. I'll be working on the north fence if you need anything. Jake climbed over the fence and stood quietly in the corral, not looking directly at Thunder but letting the horse take his measure. Thunder snorted and moved away, but he didn't panic or try to escape, which was a good sign. Jake had learned long ago that the first step in training any horse was simply being present without demanding anything. He leaned against the fence post and began talking in a low, steady voice, not particularly caring what he said but letting Thunder get used to the sound of his voice. You're a handsome fellow, aren't you? I bet you come from good bloodlines. My father would have appreciated a horse like you. Thunder's ears flicked toward Jake, and though the horse maintained his distance, Jake could see curiosity beginning to replace some of the wariness. It was a start. Jake spent the morning in the corral, sometimes talking to Thunder, sometimes just standing quietly and letting the horse observe him. Gradually, Thunder's movements became less agitated, and he began to graze calmly even with Jake present. It was slow progress, but it was progress nonetheless. Around noon, Sarah appeared with a sandwich and a glass of cold milk. Thought you might be getting hungry, she said, handing the food through the fence. Thank you, Jake said, genuinely touched by the thoughtfulness. How's he doing? Sarah looked at Thunder, who was standing about 20 feet away, watching them with alert but no longer frightened eyes. Better than I've seen him with anyone except Sam. You have a gift. Maybe. Or maybe I just understand what it's like to be suspicious of people offering help. Sarah gave him a sharp look, and Jake realized he had revealed more than he intended. "Trust is hard to rebuild once it's been broken," she said quietly. "Yes, it is." They stood in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching Thunder as he gradually worked up the courage to move closer to them. The horse was clearly torn between curiosity and caution, wanting to investigate but not quite ready to risk it. "Sam told me about your family," Sarah said eventually. "I hope you don't mind. He thought I should know why you might need some space and understanding." Jake felt his jaw tighten, not from anger but from the familiar pain that always came when his loss was acknowledged. "It's all right. I suppose it's obvious that something happened to me. Grief has a way of marking a person. But so does healing, when someone is ready for it." Sarah paused, choosing her words carefully. "I want you to know that this is a safe place, Mr. Morrison. Whatever you need to work through, whatever demons you're fighting, you can do it here without judgment." The kindness in her words was almost overwhelming, and Jake had to look away to compose himself. "I don't know if I'm ready for healing," he admitted. "Some days I think the anger is the only thing keeping me alive." "Anger can be useful for a while," Sarah agreed. "But it's like a fire, it can warm you when you're cold, but if you let it burn too long, it'll consume everything you have left." Jake nodded, understanding the truth in her words even if he wasn't sure how to act on it. "I appreciate what you and Sam are doing for me. I really do. But I don't want you to expect too much. I'm not sure there's enough left of who I used to be to salvage." "You might be surprised," Sarah said with a gentle smile. "Sometimes the best parts of a person are the ones that survive the worst experiences." After Sarah left, Jake continued working with Thunder, gradually building trust through patience and consistency. By late afternoon, the horse was allowing Jake to stand within 10 feet of him without showing signs of distress, which was significant progress for one day. Sam appeared as the sun was beginning to set, looking pleased with what he observed. "How did it go?" "Good. He's starting to trust me, but it'll take time." "You can't rush this kind of thing." "No, you can't," Sam agreed, giving Jake a meaningful look. "Same principle applies to people, I've found." That evening at supper, Jake found himself talking more freely than he had since arriving at the ranch. He told Sam and Sarah about his father's approach to horse training, about the methods that had been passed down through generations of Morrisons who understood that true partnership required mutual respect rather than domination. "Your father sounds like he was a wise man," Sam said. "He was. He used to say that you could tell a lot about a person by how they treated animals that couldn't fight back. Said it revealed their true character." "Smart man," Sarah agreed. "What would he think about your current path? The search for the men who killed your family?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, considering the question seriously. "I don't know," he said finally. "Part of me thinks he would understand the need for justice. But part of me thinks he would be disappointed in what I become in pursuit of it." "What do you think you've become?" Sam asked gently. Jake struggled with the answer, not because he didn't know, but because saying it out loud made it more real. "Someone who thinks about killing more than living. Someone who sees enemies everywhere and doesn't remember how to trust in anything good." He looked up at Sam and Sarah, seeing only compassion in their faces. "Someone who's forgotten what he's fighting for, only what he's fighting against." "The fact that you can recognize that suggests there's more of your father's son left in you than you think," Sarah said softly. That night, as Jake lay in his bed listening to the peaceful sounds of the ranch, he found himself thinking about his father's voice, trying to remember the lessons that had shaped him before grief and anger had taken over. His father had been a man of strong principles, someone who believed in justice but also in mercy, in protecting the innocent but not in becoming consumed by hatred. Would his father have wanted him to spend 3 months hunting killers, growing harder and colder with each passing day? Or would he have wanted Jake to grieve, to heal, and eventually to build something positive from the ashes of what had been lost? Jake didn't have answers to those questions yet, but, for the first time in months, he was beginning to think the questions themselves might be important. Maybe Sam was right that a man needed something to live for, not just something to die for. Maybe the real challenge wasn't just finding the Castellanos, but figuring out who Jake Morrison would be after he found them. As he drifted off to sleep, Jake made a decision. He would give himself time at the Double F Ranch, time to remember who he had been before tragedy had redefined him. He would work with Thunder, learn to trust and be trusted again, and, maybe, if he was very lucky, he would discover that there was still enough of his father's son left to build a life worth living. The hunt for the Castellanos could wait. For the first time in 3 months, Jake Morrison had something more important to do than pursue revenge. He had a chance to remember what it meant to be human, and he wasn't going to waste it. 3 weeks had passed since Jake's arrival at the Double F Ranch, and the changes in both man and horse were remarkable. Thunder now allowed Jake to approach him freely, even seeking out his attention in the mornings when Jake appeared at the corral. The stallion would come to the fence, nickering softly, and accept treats from Jake's hand with the easy trust of an animal who had learned that some humans could be counted on. Jake himself was beginning to fill out again, Sarah's cooking and regular meals having restored some of the weight he had lost during his months of wandering. More importantly, the hollow look in his eyes was slowly being replaced by something that resembled peace, though the shadows of his grief remained close to the surface. On this particular morning, Jake was working with Thunder on accepting a halter when he heard the sound of approaching horses. He looked up to see 3 riders coming down the main road to the ranch, and something about their posture and the way they sat their mounts made him instantly alert. These weren't casual visitors or neighboring ranchers stopping by for a friendly chat. Jake slipped out of the corral and made his way toward the main house, where Sam had emerged onto the porch, Sarah appearing beside him. The riders were close enough now that Jake could make out their faces, and he didn't like what he saw. Hard men with calculating eyes and weapons worn with the ease of frequent use. "Mr. Fletcher?" The leader of the group, a tall man with a graying beard and a scar that ran from his ear to his throat, dismounted and approached the porch. "Name's Castellano. Carlos Castellano. I believe you have something that belongs to me." The name hit Jake like a physical blow, and his hand moved instinctively toward his gun. These were the men he had been hunting for 3 months, the killers who had destroyed his family. They were here, on the ranch that had become his sanctuary, threatening the people who had shown him kindness. "I'm not sure what you think I have, Mr. Castellano," Sam said calmly, though Jake could see the tension in his shoulders. "But you're welcome to state your business." "My business is with a horse thief named Morrison. Jake Morrison. We have reliable information that he's been seen in this area, and that he's stolen a valuable stallion from my ranch." Jake felt his world shift, understanding immediately what was happening. The Castellanos had found him, but they weren't here for revenge or justice. They were here to claim Thunder, probably with forged papers that would appear legitimate to any sheriff who didn't look too closely. "There's no horse thief here," Sarah said firmly, her voice carrying a strength that belied her gentle appearance. "And I resent the implication that we would harbor criminals." Castellano smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. "Ma'am, I appreciate your loyalty to your hired hand, but facts are facts. Morrison stole that black stallion from my property, and I've come to collect what's mine." Jake stepped out from behind the barn where he had been listening, his hand resting on his gun. "That's a lie, Castellano, and we both know it." The 3 men turned toward him, and Jake saw recognition flicker in Castellano's eyes, followed by something that might have been surprise. Clearly, they had expected to find a broken man easy to intimidate, not someone who looked like he might fight back. Well, Castellano said, his hand moving to rest on his own weapon. "Jake Morrison. You've led us quite a chase, boy. 3 months is a long time to spend hunting one man." "Not long enough, apparently," Jake replied, his voice steady despite the rage building in his chest. "And Thunder isn't stolen. Sam Fletcher bought him legally from a breeder near Helena." "I'm afraid you're mistaken," Castellano said, pulling a folded paper from his jacket. "I have a bill of sale right here that proves that stallion is mine. Stolen from my ranch 2 months ago by a man matching your description." Jake knew the paper was forged, but he also knew it would probably be convincing enough to satisfy any legal authority in the territory. The Castellanos had been operating successfully for years, and they understood how to manipulate the system to their advantage. "That's convenient," Sam said, stepping down from the porch. "A bill of sale that appears just when you need it."
Tell me, Mr. Castellano, do you have any other proof of ownership? Witnesses who saw the alleged theft. A description of the horse that matches more than just his color? Castellano's eyes hardened. I don't need to prove anything to you, old man. I have legal documentation, and I'm taking my horse. Anyone who interferes will be considered an accomplice to theft.
And anyone who tries to steal my horse will be considered a thief, Sam replied evenly.
Mr. Morrison is my employee, and that stallion is part of my livestock.
If you have legal claims, you can take them up with the sheriff in Cedar Ridge. The sheriff is a reasonable man, Castellano said with a smirk. I'm sure he'll see things my way once I explain the situation.
Jake understood the implication immediately.
Either the sheriff was already in Castellano's pocket, or the gang leader was confident he could buy or intimidate the lawman into compliance. Either way, involving the authorities would only play into Castellano's hands.
There's another way to settle this, Jake said quietly, and everyone turned to look at him. Single combat. Me against you, Castellano. Winner takes the horse and walks away. Castellano laughed, a harsh sound that held no humor. You think I'm stupid enough to risk my life over one horse? I've got 3 men and legal documentation.
I don't need to prove anything with my gun. Maybe not, Jake said, taking a step closer. But I know who you really are, Castellano. You and your men burned out the Morrison ranch 3 months ago. Killed my father, my brother, and my sister in cold blood.
So this isn't really about thunder, is it? This is about finishing what you started.
The atmosphere around the group shifted instantly, becoming charged with deadly tension. Castellano's men spread out slightly, their hands moving toward their weapons, while Sam and Sarah exchanged a look that spoke of long partnership and shared understanding. I don't know what you're talking about, Morrison, Castellano said, but Jake could see the calculation in his eyes.
I'm a legitimate rancher pursuing a legal claim.
You're a murderer and a thief, Jake said flatly.
And if you try to take that horse, I'll kill you where you stand. Jake, Sam said quietly, think about what you're doing.
I am thinking, Jake replied, not taking his eyes off Castellano.
I'm thinking that some fights can't be avoided, only delayed. And I'm thinking that I'm tired of running. Castellano studied Jake for a long moment, clearly reassessing his opponent. You've changed, Morrison.
3 months ago, you were a broken man stumbling around the territory like a lost child.
Now you look like someone who might actually be dangerous.
3 months ago, I didn't have anything to protect except my own anger, Jake said.
Now I do.
The admission surprised him even as he said it, but he realized it was true. Somewhere in the past 3 weeks, the Double F Ranch had become more than just a place to hide and heal. It had become home, and Sam and Sarah had become family. Thunder had become his responsibility. For the first time since his family's death, Jake had something worth fighting for that wasn't just revenge. I tell you what, Castellano said after a moment.
I'm a sporting man. We'll make this interesting. A contest. If your horse can outrun mine over a fair distance, I'll forget about my claim and ride away.
But if my horse wins, I take the stallion and you come with me to answer for your crimes.
What crimes? Sarah demanded.
Mr. Morrison hasn't committed any crimes. Horse theft, for one, Castellano replied smoothly. Resisting legal authority, for another.
I'm sure we can think of more if we need to. Jake understood the trap.
If he refused the challenge, Castellano would simply take Thunder by force and probably kill anyone who tried to stop him. If he accepted and lost, he would be at Castellano's mercy, which meant certain death.
But if he won? What's the distance? Jake asked.
From here to that ridge and back, Castellano said, pointing to a distant hill about 2 miles away. Fair and square, no tricks.
And if I win, you and your men ride away and never come back to this ranch. Agreed.
Jake looked at Sam and Sarah, seeing worry and determination in their faces. He knew they would fight to protect him and Thunder if it came to that, but he also knew that would likely get them killed. This was his burden, his responsibility. I need a few minutes to prepare Thunder, Jake said.
Of course. We wouldn't want it to be unfair.
Jake walked back to the corral where Thunder waited, the stallion sensing the tension in the air and dancing nervously. Jake entered the corral and approached the horse slowly, speaking in the calm, steady voice that Thunder had learned to trust.
Easy, boy.
I know you're scared, but I need your help.
These are bad men, and they want to take you away from here. But we're not going to let that happen, are we?
Thunder nickered softly and allowed Jake to stroke his neck, the contact seeming to calm both horse and man. Jake had never actually ridden Thunder, had been building up to that step gradually as part of the training process. But he could feel the stallion's trust, and he knew that Thunder would carry him if asked.
Sam appeared at the fence, his face grim. Jake, you don't have to do this. We can fight them together.
No, Jake said firmly. This is my fight, and I won't see you and Sarah hurt because of my past. He looked at the older man who had become like a father to him.
But I need you to know something.
These past 3 weeks, working here with you and Sarah, it's reminded me who I used to be.
Who I want to be again. And who is that?
A man who protects the people he cares about. A man who keeps his word.
A man my father would be proud of.
Jake paused, stroking Thunder's mane. Whatever happens out there, I want you to know that finding this place, finding you and Sarah, it saved me. Even if I don't survive this, you saved me.
Sam gripped Jake's shoulder firmly. You're going to survive this, son.
And, when you do, you'll still have a home here for as long as you want it.
Jake nodded, not trusting his voice.
He led Thunder out of the corral and quickly saddled him, the stallion accepting the unfamiliar equipment with the trust that had been built over weeks of patient work. Thunder was nervous but willing, and Jake could feel the powerful muscles beneath him as he swung into the saddle. Castellano was mounted on a lean sorrel gelding that looked fast and experienced. His two companions had positioned themselves where they could watch the race and intervene if necessary, their hands resting casually on their weapons.
Ready, Morrison? Castellano called.
Jake nodded, leaning forward to whisper in Thunder's ear.
This is it, boy. Show them what Montana horses can do. At Sam's signal, both riders spurred their horses forward, and the race began.
Thunder shot ahead like a black arrow, his powerful stride eating up the ground with a smooth efficiency that spoke of perfect breeding and natural ability. Jake felt the wind in his face and the rhythm of Thunder's movement beneath him, and, for a moment, all his problems fell away. This was pure speed and power and the ancient partnership between horse and rider.
Castellano's sorrel was fast, but Thunder was faster.
By the time they reached the ridge, the stallion had opened up a lead of several lengths, and Jake could see the frustration on Castellano's face as they turned for the return journey. But, as they started back toward the ranch, Jake heard the sharp crack of a rifle, and saw dirt kick up near Thunder's hooves. Castellano's men were shooting, not to kill, but to spook Thunder and give their leader an advantage. It was exactly the kind of cheating Jake had expected from men with no honor. Thunder shied at the gunshots but didn't panic, his trust in Jake keeping him focused despite the frightening sounds. Jake leaned low over the stallion's neck, urging him on while keeping alert for more shots. They were still in the lead, but Castellano was closing the gap, his horse fresher from running a cleaner line while Thunder had to dodge the rifle fire. Another shot rang out, this one closer, and Jake felt Thunder stumble slightly. Not hit, but startled enough to break stride.
Castellano pulled even with them, a triumphant grin on his face.
But Thunder had heart, the kind of courage that couldn't be trained but had to be born into a horse's spirit. The stallion found his stride again and began to pull away, his competitive nature overriding his fear. Jake could feel the horse's determination beneath him, and he knew they were going to win. They crossed the finish line with Thunder a full length ahead of Castellano's gelding, both horses lathered with sweat but Thunder still full of fight. Jake brought the stallion to a sliding stop and turned to face Castellano, who was approaching with murder in his eyes. Good race, Jake said calmly, though his heart was pounding with adrenaline and triumph.
I believe you agreed to honor the result.
Castellano's hand was on his gun, his face twisted with rage.
The hell I did.
My men were shooting at wolves, not interfering with the race.
And, even if they were, what are you going to do about it? File a complaint?
Jake realized he had been naive to expect honor from men who had none. This had never been about a fair contest or legal ownership. It had been about getting Jake isolated and vulnerable, and he had walked right into the trap. But, as Castellano drew his gun, Jake heard the distinctive sound of a rifle being cocked behind him. He turned to see Sam and Sarah approaching, both armed and both looking deadly serious. I believe the agreement was that you would honor the result of the race, Sam said, his rifle trained on Castellano.
Are you saying your word means nothing?
This is none of your business, old man, Castellano snarled. Everything that happens on my land is my business, Sam replied calmly. And, right now, I'm seeing 3 armed men threatening my hired hand after losing a fair contest.
That makes it very much my business.
Sarah had positioned herself where she could cover Castellano's men, and Jake could see that she was comfortable with the weapon in her hands.
These weren't helpless victims to be intimidated.
They were people who had built something worth defending, and they weren't going to give it up without a fight. You won the race fair and square, Jake, Sam continued. And Mr. Castellano gave his word.
I expect him to honor it.
Castellano looked around at the 3 rifles pointed at him and his men, and Jake could see him calculating odds. 3 against 3, but his opponents had the advantage of position and the moral certainty that came with defending their home. This isn't over, Morrison, Castellano said finally, holstering his weapon. I'll be back, and next time I won't be so sporting. If you come back to my ranch, you won't leave it alive, Sam said quietly, and there was something in his voice that convinced everyone present that he meant exactly what he said. Castellano and his men rode away, but Jake knew it was a temporary reprieve, not a permanent solution. They would be back, probably with more men and a better plan. The sanctuary he had found at the Double F Ranch was no longer safe, not as long as he remained. They'll come back, Jake said as he dismounted from Thunder, the stallion blowing hard but uninjured. Let them, Sarah said firmly.
This is our home, and we don't abandon our family when trouble comes calling. Family.
The word hit Jake with unexpected force, and he realized that Sarah meant it exactly the way it sounded. Somehow, without his even noticing, these people had adopted him, accepted him as one of their own. The thought was both comforting and terrifying.
I can't ask you to fight my battles, Jake said.
You're not asking, Sam replied, checking his rifle and reloading it carefully.
We're volunteering.
And, before you start talking about leaving to protect us, you should know that won't solve anything.
Castellano isn't just after you anymore. He's been challenged and embarrassed, and he won't forget that.
Whether you stay or go, he'll be back to settle the score. Jake understood the truth in Sam's words, but he also understood something else. For 3 months, he had been running from his grief and his anger, looking for enemies to fight and wrongs to avenge. But, here at the Double F Ranch, he had found something worth protecting, something worth building. The question now was whether he was strong enough and wise enough to fight for it in the right way. As he led Thunder back to the corral, cooling him down and checking him for injuries, Jake made a decision. He was done running, done being the broken man who had stumbled into Cedar Ridge weeks ago. The Castellanos wanted a fight, and they would get one. But it would be on Jake's terms, fought for the right reasons, in defense of the life he was building rather than in service to the death he had been carrying. For the first time in months, Jake Morrison knew exactly who he was and what he was fighting for. And that made all the difference in the world. 2 days after the confrontation with Castellano, Jake stood on the ridge overlooking the Double F Ranch, watching the sun rise over the mountains and trying to make peace with the decision he had reached. The morning air was crisp with the promise of winter, and smoke rose from the chimney of the main house where Sarah was preparing breakfast. It looked peaceful, perfect even, but Jake knew that peace was fragile and might not survive what was coming. He had spent the previous day and night thinking, planning, and coming to terms with what needed to be done. Castellano would return, probably within the week, and, when he did, it would be with enough men to overwhelm any resistance. The gang leader's pride had been wounded, and men like that didn't forgive or forget. They escalated. Jake made his way down to the ranch house, where Sam was already up, sitting on the porch with his morning coffee and looking out over the pastures with the satisfaction of a man who had built something lasting and good. He looked up as Jake approached, taking in his expression and posture with the eye of someone who had learned to read people well.
"You've got the look of a man who's made a hard decision," Sam said, gesturing toward an empty chair beside him. Jake sat down, accepting the cup of coffee that appeared as if by magic. Sarah had a way of anticipating what people needed before they knew it themselves. "I have. And you're not going to like it. Try me." Jake took a sip of the strong coffee, gathering his thoughts. "Castellano will be back. We both know that.
And, when he comes, he'll bring enough men to finish what he started.
I can't let that happen to you and Sarah. So what are you proposing?" "I'm going after them first.
Track them down, end this before they can bring it to your door."
Sam was quiet for a long moment, studying Jake's face with those penetrating eyes. "That's the old plan, isn't it?
The one that had you wandering the territory for 3 months, getting harder and emptier with each passing day.
What makes you think it'll work better now?"
Jake had expected this question, had wrestled with it himself during the long night of planning.
"Because now I have something to come back to.
Before, I was hunting them because I wanted to die fighting.
Now I want to live, which means I have to fight smarter. And what does fighting smarter look like? It means understanding who I'm really fighting and why. The Castellanos aren't just killers and thieves.
They're a business, and, like any business, they have weak points.
Supply lines, safe houses, people who support them out of fear or greed. Cut off those supports, and they become vulnerable." Sam nodded slowly, beginning to understand. "You're talking about more than just a gunfight. I'm talking about dismantling their operation piece by piece. Making it impossible for them to operate in this territory."
Jake leaned forward, his eyes bright with purpose.
"I spent 3 months learning about them, tracking them, gathering information. I know where they get their supplies,
who buys their stolen goods, which sheriffs look the other way when they're paid enough.
I can use that. It's dangerous. And it'll take time. Everything worthwhile is dangerous. And I've got time,
as long as I know there's something worth coming back to." Sarah appeared in the doorway, having listened to enough of the conversation to understand what was being discussed.
"You're talking about leaving," she said, and there was sadness in her voice but also understanding. "For a while. But I'm also talking about coming back."
Jake looked at both of them, these people who had given him more than just work and shelter. They had given him a future worth fighting for.
"If you'll have me. This will always be your home," Sarah said firmly. "But, Jake, you don't have to do this alone. There are other ways to handle men like Castellano. Legal ways." Jake shook his head. "The law won't touch them. Too much money changing hands, too much fear. And even if it would, how long would that take? How many more families would they destroy while we waited for justice to work its way through the courts?"
Sam stood and walked to the edge of the porch, looking out over his land with the expression of a man weighing impossible choices.
"What do you need from us?" "Time. Maybe 2 months, maybe 3.
I need you to be careful, be watchful, but try to live normal lives.
Castellano will be looking for me, and, when he doesn't find me here, he might lose interest in the ranch. And, if he doesn't? Then, I'll come back whether the job is finished or not. This is my home now, and I won't let anything happen to it." They spent the morning making practical preparations.
Sam gave Jake money for supplies and ammunition, along with detailed maps of the territory that marked roads, towns, and known hiding places. Sarah packed food that would keep, along with medical supplies and spare clothes. It felt like a family sending their son off to war, which, in many ways, was exactly what it was. Jake also spent time with Thunder, working the stallion through his paces and marveling at how much the horse had developed in just a few weeks. Thunder was ready to be ridden regularly now, his trust in Jake complete and his natural athleticism beginning to shine through proper training. "I want you to keep working with him while I'm gone," Jake told Sam as they stood at the corral fence. He's got the potential to be something special, and he trusts you almost as much as he trusts me.
He's your horse, Jake. We'll just be taking care of him until you get back. The words meant more to Jake than Sam probably realized.
Ownership implied permanence, belonging, a future where Jake would return to claim what was his.
It was another anchor, another reason to survive what was coming.
That afternoon, Jake rode out from the Double F Ranch on Dolly, his few possessions packed in his saddlebags and his plans taking shape in his mind.
He looked back once to see Sam and Sarah standing on the porch, watching him go, and felt the same pang of loss he had experienced when leaving his family's ranch all those months ago. But this time was different. This time, he was leaving with the intention of returning, leaving to protect rather than to destroy. Jake's first stop was a small town called Millerville, about 30 miles west of Cedar Ridge, where he knew Castellano had contacts among the local merchants. If he was right about the gang operating like a business, then cutting off their access to supplies and safe haven would force them to expose themselves. Millerville was the kind of place where questions weren't asked as long as money was good, but Jake had learned that even the most corrupt people had limits to their tolerance. The key was finding those limits and applying the right kind of pressure. Jake spent 3 days in Millerville, drinking in the saloon, playing cards with the locals, and listening to conversations that people thought strangers couldn't understand. It didn't take long to identify Marcus Webb, the general store owner who provided supplies to the Castellanos, and Helen Crawford, who ran the boarding house where gang members stayed when they needed to lay low. Rather than confronting them directly, Jake chose a more subtle approach. He arranged for word to reach the territorial marshal that suspicious activities were being reported in Millerville, providing just enough accurate information to ensure an investigation without revealing his own involvement. Within a week, Webb found his store being watched by federal agents, and Crawford discovered that her boarding house was under scrutiny for harboring known criminals. The pressure worked exactly as Jake had hoped. Webb closed his store and moved his family to Denver, claiming he was tired of frontier life. Crawford began turning away guests who couldn't provide proper identification and references. The Castellanos' local support network crumbled without a shot being fired. From Millerville, Jake moved to Red Creek, where he knew the gang had a relationship with a corrupt sheriff named Douglas Kemp. Sheriff Kemp had been taking money to ignore certain activities and provide warnings when federal agents were in the area. Jake's approach here was different but equally effective. He arranged for evidence of Kemp's corruption to find its way to a territorial judge who was known for his integrity, along with testimony from witnesses who could no longer be intimidated into silence. When Kemp was arrested and removed from office, the Castellanos lost their protection in Red Creek and had to abandon several safe houses in the area. Jake continued this pattern for 6 weeks, moving from town to town, dismantling the network that allowed the Castellanos to operate with impunity. He cut off supply lines, eliminated safe houses, turned corrupt officials into liabilities, and generally made life so difficult for the gang that they had to spend most of their time and energy just trying to survive rather than planning new raids. But Jake knew that ultimately, the confrontation would have to be personal. All the pressure in the world wouldn't stop Castellano from returning to the Double F Ranch to settle his score. For that, Jake would need to face the man directly, and he would need every advantage he could get. The opportunity came in early November when Jake's network of informants told him that Castellano and his remaining men were holed up in an abandoned mining camp called Silver Falls, about 40 miles north of Cedar Ridge. The gang leader was reportedly furious about the systematic destruction of his operation and was planning something big to re-establish his reputation. Jake knew this was his chance. Castellano would be angry, desperate, and possibly careless. His men would be demoralized by weeks of running and hiding. If Jake was going to end this, now was the time. He spent 2 days scouting Silver Falls, learning the layout of the camp and the routines of the men hiding there. Castellano had 5 men with him, all experienced gunfighters, but they were nervous and jumpy from weeks of pressure. They were also drinking heavily, which would slow their reflexes and cloud their judgment. On a cold November morning, with snow beginning to fall from gray clouds, Jake rode into Silver Falls alone. He left Dolly tied safely away from the camp and approached on foot, his rifle ready and his mind clear and focused. He found Castellano sitting by a fire outside the main building, a bottle of whiskey in one hand and a gun in the other.
The man looked older than he had at the ranch, worn down by weeks of being hunted instead of being the hunter. When he saw Jake emerge from the trees, Castellano smiled, but it was the grin of a wolf backed into a corner. "Jake Morrison," Castellano said, not bothering to stand. "I was wondering when you'd work up the courage to face me directly." "I'm here."